John Pickup. He's from the Scottish Government, and he's here to talk to us about PCN and how they deal with the issue in Scotland and in the rest of Europe to give us a different perspective.
Okay, thanks very much to Louise Marie and the Global Project for inviting me to come over and speak to you. Please let me know if my voice isn't carrying. I usually speak fairly loud, but I'm not sure how my cold will cope with that. I want to talk to you about our experience in potato cyst nematode management in Scotland, and I think it'll come clear that we've had potato cyst nematode for a long time, and we have to live with it. Certainly in the UK, in ware potato production area, our estimates that at least 70% of our land is actually with potato cyst nematode, and the majority of that is Globodera Paladin. Okay, so I'm going to talk about PCN outbreaks throughout the world, eradication programs and containment, particularly in relation to what you have here in Idaho. And then I want to go into the other alternative, which is what we've got, probably 100 years of experience, 100 years more experience than you have of living with PCN and the problems that you have in terms of living with PCN. Preventing the spread of PCN with the planting of seed potatoes is addressed through an EU directive, and preventing damage in ware potato production is generally left to the individual growers. And there's issues in terms of managing yield, which is obviously important for production, and then there's managing land. And a lot of our potatoes are grown on rented land, and that creates a bit of a dilemma, because if you're actually renting land from somebody and you just want to produce a potato crop, you might not be interested in what might happen to the land for the future, because you may not be intending to rent that land again. Okay, outbreaks. Louise Marie's covered the evolution and the two species of potato cyst nematode. Basically, if land elsewhere in the world other than Central and South America has never grown potatoes, it's not going to contain PCN. If high levels of PCN are allowed to develop, potato yields will be severely compromised. And the first element of any control strategy should be outbreak management. Surveillance is important, followed by eradication, and if you can't eradicate, at least you can contain it and keep it where it started for as long as you can. Outbreaks of potato cyst nematodes have been recorded from most parts of the world where potatoes are grown. China is the only major potato producer yet to report an outbreak. Reports of PCN remain scarce from some countries with extensive potato acreages, and here I'm thinking about Australia, where potato cyst nematodes were found about 15 years ago in Victoria, and in India, and probably in some parts of the former USSR, but some parts of Ukraine have got very widespread outbreaks. And of course, probably one of the best places in the world to grow potatoes is here in North America, because you have very, very few outbreaks. The outbreaks that have been recorded in the USA are, as Louise Marie said, New York State, 1941, Idaho, 2006. Canada has Newfoundland in 1962, Vancouver Island in 1965, and Quebec in 2006. And the blue ones are Paladin, the red ones are the slightly easier to control Rostockiensis. And on top of that, you have Mexico, where PCN has been recorded from 46 counties in 9 Mexican states. PCN are treated as quarantine pests throughout the world due to the extreme damage that they can cause. In Western Europe, where PCN are widespread, there is a view from some people that PCN should be reclassified as regulated non-quarantine pests. And just to say what that actually means, well, this is the International Standard on Phytosanitary Measures, drawn up by the International Plant Protection Convention, and they have various defining criteria in relation to pest status, pathway for transmission, economic impact, and official control. And for a quarantine pest, which I would say is the North American situation, absent or of limited distribution, phytosanitary measures are in place to deal with any pathways, and that's what you see certainly here in Idaho. Economic impact, you predict that because you don't actually know what the economic impact, that doesn't really relate to PCN because we pretty much know. We've studied PCN throughout the world for so long, we know the economic impact is going to be severe. Official control, under official control where present, with the aim of eradication or containment. And if you look at the European situation, potato cyst nematodes are present and widely distributed. There are phytosanitary measures in place, but they only relate to plants for planting. We're only addressing the spread of potato cyst nematode on seed. We know the impact, and they're under official control only with respect to specified plants for planting, and the aim there is to suppress the population. We're not trying to eradicate it. Well, if you look at outbreaks worldwide, as I was asked to do about 8 years ago by the USDA and CFIA, early detection of PCN infestations has proved to be exceptionally difficult. Infestations are usually well established by the time that we find outbreaks. By the time detections have occurred, populations are generally high and causing visible damage. Very suddenly, from nowhere, they have a massive problem with potato cyst nematodes. And again, there you've got outbreaks associated with very short rotations and monoculture of potatoes, which I think was the case in Quebec and in Vancouver Island. And only really have we got proven eradication from Western Australia, and that was control that was mainly carried out by a tarmac spreader. Basically, they built on all the land on which the fields that they had a very localised infestation on the edge of Perth, and they basically put it down to building. And Vancouver Island, where they just prohibited potato production on the Saanich Peninsula, and having prohibited it now for about 35, 40 years, I think they're still intending to continue with that because they really don't want to get that genie back out of the bottle. Just a little bit about sampling for potato cyst nematode. This is what we do in Scotland. We have a small sample from a very big field. And really, it's only ever a very small amount of land. You can talk about changing sampling rates and things, but whatever you're doing, you're only ever looking at a very small percentage of the amount of soil that's in the field. You cannot test a significant proportion of that field. This is taken from the 1962 Golden Nematode Handbook that was produced by Spears over here in the States. And basically, it's a very simplistic diagram of how a population, an initial introduction of 100 cysts will increase if you grow potatoes every year in that land, and they are susceptible potatoes. So you see something like a 50-fold increase here going up. This is a log scale. So eventually, after 3 generations, you start to be able to detect it. After 4, you've got economic damage and you're losing yield. And after 5 generations, you've got visible damage. And you're seeing holes in the crop where the crop, the foliage can't be sustained because of the damage. So that's a very simple way of which PCN is coming in, but still you can't detect it at this stage. You really can only detect it at that stage. That's a population of 3.8 million cysts per hectare, and it relates to a detection rate that we use in the EU. But here, I mean, using the rates that are used by APHIS over here, it comes down a little bit, but you've really got to have a massive change in the amount of soil that you test to actually get it one generation earlier. If you introduce rotations into that, and I think you're probably growing on 3-year rotations here, would that be reasonable to assume? Yeah? You're looking at 12 years after introduction before you're actually starting to detect it. And if you're in Scotland, where we grow on 6-year rotations, you're probably looking at 30 years after detection. So basically, we face pretty much a juggernaut that is very difficult to stop once PCN are allowed to establish, because you don't see the results of introductions until maybe for us 30 years later, for you 12, 15 years later. As I said, eradication programs, Western Australia and Vancouver Island, Idaho, active eradication, fumigation, soil sterilisation. What we have in Scotland, we've got to live with PCN. PCN were believed to have been introduced into Europe as a consequence of returning to South America in the mid to latter part of the 19th century to find new potato varieties because of the outbreaks of blight that had caused devastating famines, most notably in Ireland, but actually throughout Europe in the 1845 and 1846. We seem that, that when Magellan maybe brought potatoes back, he seemed to obviously have some sort of anticipation, and he knew that Pest Status nematode was there, so he probably washed those potatoes, and we never got Pest Status nematode back in the 16th century. We got it in the 19th century. And it was first recorded in Europe in 1881 and in the UK in 1900. And basically, before we understood anything about it, it was too widespread to do anything about it. That's where you've got a great advantage here in Idaho. You've seen it relatively soon after it's been introduced, and it's nowhere near as well developed as it was before we had modern agricultural scientific knowledge in order to combat it. This is where we grow potatoes in Scotland, on the lower east coast of the country, in the maritime area. And this is where our Rostockiensis is, and that's where our Paladin is. Pretty much where we grow potatoes, we have problems to a lesser or greater extent with these two species of Cyst nematode. I was very much involved in Brussels on negotiations for the European Cyst nematode Directive. I first went to Brussels in 1992, and we finally agreed the directive in 2007. It was a long period, lots of discussion, lots of countries with very different perspectives, lots of countries with lots of knowledge of PCN, lots of countries with no knowledge of PCN. It was a very difficult negotiation, very, very complex, and it was a revision of a directive that had been introduced in 1969, which had been thought to have, generally felt to have failed. On the same day that they produced this directive, they implemented a directive on wart disease. And the wart disease, we have no wart disease in Scotland. We haven't seen wart now for over 15 years. And the reason that wart has been so effective to control is when wart's present in the land, and the first time you grow potatoes in there that are not immune to wart, you will see tubers that are affected with wart. As I say, there's this time lag with Cyst nematodes, and you do not see the issue until a lot later. The directive says that all land in which seed potatoes are to be grown has to be tested for Cyst nematode. It's established a harmonised sampling protocol to use across the EU. It prohibits production of potatoes for planting on infested fields, and it prohibits the planting of infested potatoes. It requires a survey of where potato land. That's largely so that we can still treat it as a quarantined organism, so we have to know at least a little bit about where it is in areas other than seed potato land. But it now recognises that we have so much of Europe infested with potato cyst nematode that it's naive to say in a directive that you can't grow potatoes in infested land. Also, there's companies producing nematicides, and there would be no need to produce nematicides for PCN control if you weren't supposed to be growing potatoes in infested land. It sets out measures to minimise the risk of spread, basic biosecurity measures, and it recognises resistant varieties as integral to PCN control and sets out a protocol for testing them, and also gives us a scoring system, which I see now that you're adopting over here from some of the presentations that Rich Novi was making to us at a meeting yesterday. And that scoring system is great because it means that if we say what a resistant variety is, then everybody can understand it, and different countries can know what they're doing. So, management, potato cyst nematode in wet potato land, producing table potatoes or potatoes for processing, aims to protect yield or to protect the land. Population thresholds, they're very difficult to set because there will be different thresholds for different varieties, different soil types, different rainfall, different irrigation patterns, different fertilizer rates. Generally about 10 eggs per mil, but some people on sandy soils will say 2. Some people on rich peaty soils might say 50 or even 100. If you want to protect the land and you put a susceptible variety in, your detection threshold should be 0, basically, because if you're down there at 1 egg per mil and you put a susceptible variety in, it's going to be 50 eggs per mil the next time, and therefore you're going to have a problem with the next crop. Decline rates and rotations, generally an annual natural hatch of 20 to 30% of the population, depending on the species, depending on the environment. So long rotations in the absence of a host plant are important if you can't use resistant varieties to bring the PCN under control. Nematicides, trap cuts, sterilants, biofumigants. I think Louise Marie's pretty much covered that. Success rates typically vary. You can get 50 to 90% population reductions, but if you go in afterwards with a susceptible variety, all of that's negated. You just increase the population 50-fold again. So variety choice, I think, is very important. This is the resistant varieties. We have this 1 to 9 scale, and basically it's based on the fact that if you have this is the ratio of the final population to the initial population, and so if the basis score of a variety that's susceptible is set at 2, if something is super susceptible it might score a 1, but basically if you get 50-fold multiplication with a score of 2, the score of 3 gives you 25 multiplication, and so on, and it halves down till actually you're getting less than 1% multiplication with a score of 9. So those are very resistant varieties. But you know, we have a full range of resistance now available. 10 years ago, we only had it available for Rostokiensis, but now with good breeding, particularly led by the Dutch, we have a lot of Paladin resistant varieties. But we don't have it for all uses. We don't have good resistance to Paladin for salad varieties, for punnet varieties, for speciality use, and we generally don't have it in the russets. But Agrico have bred a variety now called Basin Russet, which has high levels of resistance. And this is just a field trial where a grower came to us. He got a new infestation of PCM. We've been testing his field for years, never found anything. But actually, he'd had his land flooded, and a PCN had come in from an adjacent field. So we did a little trial in there. Half of the field, he had initial PCM population of between 2 and 4 eggs per gram. So that's his initial population. We put in the variety innovator, highly resistant, and the population went down to 0.2 eggs per gram. High level of control. Osprey, which has partial resistance, it scores a 3. That caused a big increase. And that's what varieties can do in terms of controlling potato cyst nematode. Highly effective. Management principles, rotations, nematicides, sterilants, they're effective at reducing the PI. They're valuable for containing and eradicating PCN, and they protect subsequent crop yield. But if you go in with a susceptible or weakly resistant variety, that will markedly increase your PCN population and negate the previous management of the initial population. Highly resistant varieties will markedly reduce multiplication rates and protect the future health of the land. And the problem we have is these PCN resistant varieties which have struggled to gain commercial acceptability, particularly varieties resistant to Paladin. However, I am told now that Innovator, I don't know whether this is true, but I have been told that Innovator is the most widely grown potato variety in the world now, largely because of its resistance to globodera Paladin. In Scotland, this is the incidence in seed potato land of globodera rostockiensis. It's been coming down steadily over the last 25 years. And this wagon wheel here shows the varieties with resistance. 50% of our crop has some resistance, and 45% has very high resistance to rostockiensis. 50% is totally susceptible, but that's good enough to drive the population down. Our problem with Paladin is Paladin's increasing. When I started working in Scotland, 4% of our infestations were Paladin, but this year we're on about 75% infestations Paladin. Been a massive change in 25 years. And the main reason is over 90% of our crop is totally susceptible to Paladin, and it isn't controlled if you do that. You've only got about 1 or 2%. It's growing, it's developing, but it's not growing fast enough. Only 1 or 2% that are highly resistant. Really just want to finish, because I think I'm overrunning a little bit, with looking at quarantine management status. And through things like mechanisms like the International Plant Protection Convention, we have recognised pest-free areas. Then we have eradication containment. Then you have areas where you're managing PCN populations through national regulation to some extent or not, and then you could have another area where PCN becomes completely unregulated. And I would say that the vast majority of North America is in that situation. Idaho is in this situation. In Europe, certainly in the UK, we're in that situation, and there's part of the UK that's moving more into that situation. And some areas of Europe, Finland is very much in this situation, but there's very few areas of Europe that are in that position. So here you can look at the pest status. So you have absent isolated outbreaks, widely distributed, eradication has been given up on, and then everything's been given up on. Soil testing relatively low, sufficient to justify the status. Eradication and containment, big increase in soil testing in order to isolate that outbreak and bring that under control. And that's field-based sampling. Here you could actually look at tear dirt and things just for that. With management situation, you can go to a lower intensity sampling because we know PCN's there, we just need to know how much. So we make decisions of whether we can actually plant potatoes in the land or whether we just give up. Impact of a new introduction. Very severe for a pest-free area. Yeah, as you would understand from what's happened here. It's a very severe situation should you get another introduction, because it would negate all the work that's done to try and eradicate PCN. So you need to be sure that it's unlikely that a new introduction is going to carry on. Here, very low risk of a new introduction, apart from the fact that in South America there are lots of populations which can break the resistance that's present in the resistant varieties that we're currently highly dependent upon. Your potato production, unrestricted, you don't need to worry about PCN, it's not there. Tightly controlled in an outbreak, your potato production, here and in associated areas. Here for potato production, it's really seed potato production is just prohibited in infested fields. I'll just go on to biosecurity, pest-free area, based biosecurity. There is general prohibition of planting of potatoes unless they've been brought in from a similar pest-free area. You want to have precautions on the movement of machinery and other commodities that could introduce PCN into the land. In terms of eradication and containment, strict controls on all pathways for movement of contaminated and soil from recognised infested fields. You want precautions on soil movement on associated fields as well. Here, limiting the potential for new introductions by ensuring seed potatoes are produced on PCN-free land. Not really worried about other issues of biosecurity because they're relatively negligible. PCN control measures, non-required in the pest-free area. Eradication, use of soil sterilants, trap crops, biofumigants to bring the population levels down. Potatoes and other host crop production, you really want to, it has to be prohibited in infested fields unless it's of very highly resistant populations, which you can use again to knock populations down. And really for fields that have been decontaminated and for associated fields, you want to really think about using highly resistant varieties in those fields to make sure that you're not amplifying any PCN that might be below detection level. For management, use of a variety of methods, but essentially you're relying very heavily on resistant varieties. So you need to have those resistant varieties, or you have to go to very long rotation periods to rely on the natural decline. And costs. The costs of PCN, now we need to take this a bit further, it's just an initial thought about what the cost would be. Your costs for a pest-free area are just the soil testing, which are relatively low, and then you've got full access to all your export markets because you haven't got the pest. Eradication of containment, soil testing, locally high. Prohibition of potato production in a few infested fields, which is very unfortunate for those people that happen to have acquired the infestation. Loss of production associated with trap and biofumigant crop use. You can't grow anything else when you're growing these things. Variety choice is restricted for associated fields. But the vast majority of growers in the area, you know, you say 1% infested land in Idaho. So, you know, majority of the growers in Idaho, presumably over 90%, are unaffected really by the PCN outbreak. Export markets should be unaffected for areas of production that are not associated with the outbreak. There's no reason why in other areas which can still claim pest-free status, they can't export potatoes from their production area. Management area, soil testing, it's moderate cost. There's an environmental and financial cost due to widespread nematicide use. We heard this morning talks from Neil Goodmanstat saying that, you know, we're going to lose nematicides. There's lots of regulation on their future use. We can't rely on them. Loss of yield loss, of course. Loss of production associated with using trap crops and biofumigant crops. Restricted choice of varieties. You can't just keep growing susceptible varieties. You need resistant varieties. Extended rotations. A lot of our growers now that are governed by environmental measures. Tesco produced Nature's Choice. They don't want people to use nematicides. They want people to grow susceptible varieties. So growers are having to grow in rotations of 10 to 13 years. That costs. It's very difficult to estimate what that cost is, but it's a big cost. And I think it's a big cost for growers if they have to face that. And you also, the risk of selection for resistant breaking PCM populations, and your export markets are restricted. I won't go into any more of those conclusions because I'm running over, but do I have any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that you have to label it on PCN. Was the only reason it was widely spread, or it was not worth to label it in order to label it?
You're asking why?
Why you didn't try to eradicate it?
Yeah, why we didn't try to eradicate it? Because we didn't have nematologists in the 1900s. We didn't know about nematodes. We didn't have the science background. We didn't have the knowledge that we have now, and we wouldn't have had resistant varieties. And It basically spread in the 19th century, you know, from introduction in 1880 through to maybe the First World War, and it's really only since the Second World War that we've developed the science of nematology and developed the understanding. And by that stage, it was too widespread. We didn't have any meat, we didn't have any requirement in for seed potatoes to be produced on land that was infested with potato cyst nematode. We started testing for it in about 1930 in Scotland, but it was only on a voluntary basis, and there was no requirement for seed potatoes to be produced on infested land until the UK entered the European market in 1973, and that was the first time it became obligatory. It was too late then. You have all the benefit of the knowledge that we've gained in Europe to apply here and to make wiser and better decisions.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, John.